just a little bit. I'm right now at a small bilingual church in Albuquerque, Iglesia Congregacional Unida, and they like preaching. And they'll often complain if my sermons are too short. I think that might not be quite the case here, so I'm not gonna go as long as I usually do. But if the sermon is going too short and you see me about to stop, just raise your hand and I can go on as long as you like. Have you heard God's call in your life? What Mark said to the kids, I think, is very true. God calls all of us. And I think especially the part about engineers is true. My dad is an engineer, and when he's working on something and he's really focused and fascinated on it, he can tell you about it for hours, using a lot of language that I don't always understand. There's a passion there, and passion, I think, is part of what it means to be called. But that's a big part of this story that's you kind of wonder about. How do you know if God is calling you? How do you know what God is calling you to do? And I think this story, the story of Samuel, can tell us in several ways about this. I think the first actually isn't even in the Samuel reading. The first is that whatever you're called to do, all of us are called to do something else. And the second call, the call to whatever vocation or activity or career God is calling us to, it can't violate the first call, which is to all of us. It's said many ways in the Bible, but the way I think I really like it and remember it best comes from the book of Micah. What does the Lord require of you? To seek justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with your God. Justice, loving kindness, humbleness. If you feel that God is calling you to do something and it violates those things, then it's probably not God calling you. There's probably some internal voice that wants you to do something big and bold and maybe make a real killing in the process. I used to live in Sedona, Arizona. It's an interesting place, and there's a lot of New Age spirituality there, and a lot of it, most of it is very benign, very positive. Every once in a while, you get somebody though who's maybe pushing it a little too far. Every once in a while you hear about somebody who claims to be, say, the reincarnation of Jesus, who's coming back with a new gospel to tell people how it really is, and that often involves giving them a lot of money. We had 3 of them while I was living in Sedona. And they didn't like each other because each one was the real reincarnation of Jesus. The one I knew the most about was also the reincarnation of Martin Luther and John Calvin, who I think would be just aghast to know that they were 2 incarnations of the same person, because they didn't like each other that much. How do we know? Well, if you feel that God has called you to do something that exploits people, that lies to people, that raises some people up and says their rights are more important than those of other people, that does not foster justice, that does not show loving kindness to all, and that is focused on you and your greatness and your gifts and your ego, it's not God talking to you. You're listening to some other voices welling up from within, and they're not the voices that you really maybe need to be listening to. Because when you listen to them too closely, people get hurt. The call to God is not necessarily a call to greatness and acclaim and fame and fortune either. I had a good friend when I was in Arizona. She was a Sunday school teacher at a church we were associated with, and later became our Sunday school teacher, and she was just a really, really neat person. Very kind, very caring, very bright and creative. And she worked with our kids, and they bonded to her like that. And she, Sunday school was a place they really wanted to come to because that relationship was so strong, and they learned so much, and they had so much fun doing it. I thought it was a gift. I thought that was a calling for her. Unfortunately, she had a hard time hearing it as a calling. She said, well, this is something I like to do, but I don't think it's God's calling for me, because I think God wants me to do something big, something important. She wanted to be kind of a prophetic voice, which I didn't think she necessarily had the calling for, because she would come to me and tell me about all these things that she had discerned from reading the Bible and listening to radio preachers. Remember one time we had a long conversation about whether yeast is evil. I don't think it is, but apparently somebody who had an influence over her thought it really was evil, and that if you eat any leavened bread, your soul is in jeopardy. Or possibly she just said that to get a rise out of me. She said that she thought what God was calling her to do was to proclaim the end times and call the United States back to faith. And I said, well, okay. Why do you think that? And she said, well, I just know it, because God wants me to do something big. And she quit her job as Sunday school teacher, and she drifted away from us and ended a number of relationships so she could pursue this call. And I didn't hear from her for months. And when I did hear from her, she'd kind of dropped that, realizing that wasn't God's call for her, and she was off on some new call. And I thought that was sad. Because, I mean, it's always difficult to judge what someone else's call was, but the way she was with those kids was so beautiful and so powerful. And she made such a difference in their lives. And I think what happened was she had a lot of people in her life who kind of tore her down and told her she wasn't important and her gifts didn't matter and the things she didn't make a difference. And she really wanted to make a difference. And unfortunately, all those things she heard from other people blinded her to the difference she was making. They blinded her to the fact that she had heard and answered God's call. I hope that in the years since then, she has heard the voice of God more clearly than the voices of those people who told her she wasn't important. Those voices that tell us we aren't important, those voices that tell us we don't make a difference in simple acts of loving kindness are invariably lies. They're not true. Every one of us has the power to make a difference when we respond to God's call, when we find that place where our passions and our gifts direct us, when we find that place where we can really do the first call. Seek justice, love kindness, walk humbly. Oh, I think, we like big. In America, we think big. And when you ask somebody what a success is, they'll very likely point to someone famous, someone who's rich, someone who's made a lot of money. And they'll say that's the model of success. That's who we need to be. I don't think that's really the case at all. And I don't think it has to be a big dramatic thing. Nancy mentioned other leaders in Israel who were absent in the time of 1 Samuel. There was Moses. Think about Moses' call. He saw this burning bush. And people think about that and they think, wow, if God really wants you, he's going to do something big like a burning bush. There's no way you can make a mistake about that. Martin Luther was hit by lightning, or almost hit by lightning. And he knew that was God's call for him because God was not being subtle. But it doesn't always happen that way. And you can see that in the story of Samuel. In Samuel, it was just a voice. The voice said Samuel. Said it several times. Didn't say much more that we know of. And yet that voice powerfully changed his life. I can relate to that. My own call to ministry started pretty young. I was in 7th grade. I remember that. And I had been on a couple of church experiences. I was in a confirmation class. I really admired the pastor who led that and the pastors and seminarians at church camp, because they were the image of what I thought a good person should be. They were wise. They understood God in a way that I envied. They understood how that applied to their lives and and I saw the way it made them more honest, kinder, more thoughtful. And I really admired that. And I said, that's what I want to do when I grow up. And I was pretty much that way through junior high school and high school, despite the fact that some of my friends were saying, you want to do what? That's weird. And some of my friends' parents said, well, religion isn't really a growth industry. If you want to really be a success, you need to look at what jobs are there that you can get now that are really going to take off in a few years. And I would always say, no, I feel like God is calling me, but it wore me down over time. So when I got in college, I thought, I really have been so narrowly focused. Maybe I should look a little broader. And so I looked into a whole lot of things. Usually each thing for only a semester, and then I decided, well, maybe it's something else. So I went through, I looked into astronomy, and I thought that was wonderful, except for the physics and the math part. And I looked at speech therapy. I looked at all kinds of things. And it wasn't until my junior year I thought, boy, I'm going to graduate and I'm not going to know what it is I want. I don't even know what my major is. I better sit down and look at my credits and figure out what I've done the most of, and maybe that'll be my major. And then I thought, well, what if I look at ministry again? And I realized when I thought about that, I had this sense of peace. Every other career I'd looked at, there was something missing. And it was when I started thinking about ministry again that I felt like that missing piece came back to me. It wasn't a burning bush. It wasn't being stricken off my donkey on the road to to Jericho. It wasn't anything big or flashy or exciting. It was something pretty small. And I find that I'm not alone in this. Martin Luther King once wrote this about his own sense of call to ministry. He said, "My call to ministry was neither dramatic nor spectacular. It came neither from a miraculous vision or some blinding light experience on the road of life. Moreover, it did not come as a sudden realization. Rather, it was a response to an inner urge that gradually came upon me. That urge expressed itself in a desire to serve God and humanity, and the feeling that my talent and my commitment could best be expressed through the ministry. At first, I planned to be a physician. Then I turned my attention in the direction of law. But as I passed through the that part was not a quote. As I passed through the preparation stages of these two professions, I still felt that within that underlying urge to serve God and humanity through the ministry. During my senior year in college, I decided to accept the challenge to enter the ministry, and I came to see that God had placed a responsibility upon my shoulders. And the more I tried to escape it, the more frustrated I would become. A few months after preaching my first sermon, I entered theological seminary. This, in brief, is an account of my call and pilgrimage to ministry. I can really relate to that. In some ways, his sense of call and mine were kind of similar. And I think we see that too in Samuel. There was not a big, flashy, dramatic incident that happened to Samuel. Samuel was young. We don't know exactly how young, but pretty young. He'd been serving in the temple since he was very, very young, since he was a little boy. He was serving the high priest Eli. Eli was almost blind, and he needed a lot of help. And he had two sons who were also priests, but they weren't much help. And anyway, Eli was asleep in the temple. Samuel was asleep in the temple, and Samuel heard a voice. Samuel. He thought, what? Okay, well, the only other person here is Eli, so let me go see what he wants. And he went, and he found Eli, and Eli was asleep, and so he probably shook him awake and said, I heard you call. What do you want? And Eli, and those of you who have been parents maybe can appreciate the joy Eli felt at being awakened at probably 3 a.m. by a child with a question. I didn't call you. Go back to bed. So Samuel went back to bed. And he lay down and he closed his eyes and he heard the voice. Samuel. So he got up and he thought, okay, that's weird. I guess he changed his mind. So he went back in, and Eli was just getting to sleep, and so he shook him again and said, Eli, what do you want? And Eli said, what? I don't want anything. I'm not going to want anything till morning. Go back to bed. So Samuel went back to bed. And a third time, he heard the voice. Samuel! So he got up and he thought, oh boy, here we go again. So he went into Eli's room, shook Eli and said, Eli, did you want something this time? Now Eli comes out of a tradition of Hebrew wisdom, and one of the principles that you hear in that is when you hear something that you think or see something you think might be a sign from God, one time it might be something else. Twice it might just be a coincidence. It might just be a weird thing that happened 2 times in a row. 3 times they thought, that's pushing coincidence a little too far. Maybe this is God calling. And so Eli said, okay, look, Samuel, I didn't call you. I think it might be God calling you. So if you go back and you hear this voice again, say, don't come wake me up. But say to the voice, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And so Samuel went back and he lay down and he heard the voice, Samuel. And he said, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. And that's where it began. That's when he knew he was hearing a call from God. Because the call from God is persistent. It's a good thing, too. When those of us in clergy talk about our call, and we're called to do it in seminary over and over and over and over until we're really kind of sick of talking about it. It's a good thing that God is more persistent than your seminary orals committee. Because you can keep coming back and you can keep saying, no, I heard God's call, I feel God's call, and it hasn't gone away. And that's one way I've heard you know what God's call is. Because if it is God's call and not something else, it won't give up. It will keep after you until you do it. And you can deny and run away from it for as long as you want, but it will still be there, calling you to be a better person, to do better things, to make a difference. So the call to God, it always is in harmony with those principles of seeking justice, loving kindness, walking humbly. It's something that comes and is persistent. It's also something that's kind of difficult. We didn't read the rest of the story of Samuel. It's not as beautiful as the part we did read. When Samuel answers God's call, the first thing God does is to dump a really stinker of an assignment on him. Eli's sons have been abusing their privileges as priests of the temple. And Eli's been turning a blind eye to it because they're his sons. And because he's mostly blind. And the voice of God says to Samuel, this is wrong. I need you to confront Eli, the man who's raised you since you were a little kid, your hero. I want you to confront him and tell him that this is not acceptable. And God's judgment is coming on him and his sons. And that was probably about the last thing Eli wanted to hear. Martin Luther King, as he was following his call, was approached by leaders in the civil rights movement who said, we've heard you speak. We know where your heart is. We know that you have the gifts to really take this movement and be a powerful leader. And maybe you can help bring about the change we need to see in this country. And his first response was, well, that's really nice of you to ask, but I've kind of got other plans. I'm working on my doctorate, and I'm the head pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and this really doesn't fit into my idea of where my life is going. He promised to think about it, and he thought about it, and he prayed about it, and he found he couldn't get away from it, even though it was difficult, even though it was scary, even though it was dangerous. And if you've seen the films from that time, if you remember those times, protesters, peaceful protesters, as the young man very accurately said in the children's time, these peaceful protesters were often put in jail, set upon with fire hoses and attack dogs, and treated just not only horribly, but physically hurt. And there were death threats. There were threats against Dr. King. There were threats against his family. And it was hard to come to terms with all of that. But King came to a place where he said, I have seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get there. He faced the fear. He faced the difficulty of the call God had made for him. And it gave him a deep sense of peace, so that even with this sense that he might not live through to see the end of the effort, even then, he knew he was following his call, and he felt a rightness, a properness, and he would not step away from that. I have not yet ever gotten a death threat for anything in my ministry. I hope I don't. But I do think that God doesn't call us to a position where we're going to be comfortable and happy and get everything we want. God calls us, each of us, to make a change in the world for the better, and the world doesn't always want to change, not even for the better. And that can be a little difficult. When I was approached to go to Iglesia, the conference minister came and said, I know you're looking for a church position. They're looking for a pastor. What could be more natural? And I said, I don't speak Spanish. And he said, that's okay. They pretty much all speak English. And they're down on South Broadway. Well, if you're in Albuquerque, South Broadway has kind of a connotation. It's not the place you leave your car parked. It's a rough area. And as I got to know the people there, they were some of the most wonderful, loving, amazing people in the world. But boy, their lives were not something I'd ever expected. I get, could you please visit my husband? He's in the hospital in most churches. And there it was, could you please visit my teenage son? He's in jail. There was a young lady who came to our church as a visitor, and hopefully she'll be back. But she was in a wheelchair, and her mother told everyone in Spanish why she was in the wheelchair, and it just went completely. I speak a little bit of Spanish now, but not enough to follow all that. And so someone explained to me after they'd left that her daughter was in the wheelchair because she had a boyfriend, and the boyfriend was in a gang, and she tried to break up with him, and he got mad at that, and so he shot her and ran her over with his car. It was a different sort of situation, and the differences were a little intimidating at first. The differences made me think once or twice about it. Ultimately, I thought, maybe this is God's call for me. And I went there, and I think I have received at least as much and probably more from serving them than they have received from me. Is because those difficult and frightening things that tend to scare us up front, when you actually face them, they become much smaller. They become much more manageable. It's a big thing about fear I've found over the years. When you face it, when you say, I'm going to do this anyway because I feel God is calling me to do this, the fear loses its power over you. And you find that you can do things that you might never have thought were possible before. And that's maybe the last thing about the call of God. And it's the part that's maybe sometimes the hardest to discern. If you hear a call from God to be in the ministry, or to be a teacher, or to be an engineer, or to be a scientist, or to be a policeman or a fireman, and you see how that answers the needs of God's children and fulfills the gifts God has given you, and you see how there's a passion in you for that, and you get past the fear, and you see that through you God is making a difference in the world. There's a great sense of peace that comes with that. There's a great sense of purpose. There's a great sense that God is with you. That doesn't mean you don't ever experience the doubts or the fear again, and there have been a couple of times in my life when I've felt that, and I've thought, oh God, I know you called me to do this, but I'm not sure you knew what you were thinking of. And yet if you face that and stay true to your call, you find that, well, no, God isn't the one who didn't understand the situation. I didn't understand the situation. Because following your call requires faith, trust. But when you do, you find that it is your call, and it does make a difference, and it does make you better, and it does make the world better. So I'll ask you again, has God called you? Because I think God has, and if you're not aware of where God has called you or is calling you, pay attention. Don't let yourself get scared off. Think about your gifts. Think about the needs around you. And when God calls, say, "Speak, Lord. Your servant is listening."